There's a kind of love that never knocks on the front door. It doesn't send letters ahead of itself or arrive wearing its finest clothes. It doesn't whisper sweet things in candlelit rooms or press flowers between the pages of poetry books. No, that kind of love, the kind worth keeping, the kind that actually holds you together when everything else falls apart, it shows up differently. It shows up in the dark, in the dirt, in the quiet spaces between two people who haven't found the words yet. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. How we spend the better half of our lives chasing something that looks like love in the stories we were told as children, only to walk right past the real thing because it wasn't wearing the right costume. This is a story about a young woman who packed everything she owned into a traveling case and crossed over 2,000 miles of open country looking for something she couldn't quite name. She found something harder to see coming and so much harder to let go of. Something that didn't announce itself. Something quiet and calloused and achingly, deeply real. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled, because I have a feeling this one is going to travel far. Her name was Rose Calloway. In the morning she arrived in the dusty little settlement of Redstone Creek, she was already wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. The coach door swung open and the heat rolled in like something alive. Rose gripped the handle of her traveling case, pressed her free hand against the door frame to steady herself, and stepped down into the blinding noon light. She was wearing dove gray silk with ivory buttons down the front, and she looked the way a person looks when they have taken a very wrong turn somewhere around the middle of the country and kept going anyway, head up, jaw set, pretending they meant to end up here. She scanned the length of the wooden boardwalk. Weathered faces, sunburned necks, a woman in a faded calico bonnet carrying a basket of eggs, a dog sleeping in a patch of shadow, unbothered by anything, a boy chasing something Rose couldn't see. Nobody came forward. She had memorized his photograph. Strong jaw, dark eyes that gave nothing away. The letter had said he would be waiting at the coach stop. The letter had said a great many things. Words on paper have a way of sounding warmer than the people who wrote them. A man stepped out from the shadow of the general store. Tall, sun-darkened skin, hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked toward her without hurrying, without smiling, without any of the small social performances that people usually offer when meeting someone for the first time. He stopped 3 feet away and looked directly at her traveling trunk. Miss Calloway. Yes, you must be. He didn't answer that. He just bent down, picked up the trunk like it weighed nothing, turned, and started walking toward a buckboard wagon at the far end of the street. No handshake, no tip of the hat, no how was your journey or welcome to Redstone Creek, or any of the 100 ordinary kindnesses a person might expect. Rose stood alone in the settling dust, her gloved hand still half extended toward nothing at all. The dog in the patch of shadow opened one eye, looked at her, and closed it again. His name was Eli Trask, and he was the man she had agreed to marry. The wagon ride took 6 hours. Rose's back ached against the hard wooden seat before the first hour was done. Her throat had been dry since somewhere around mile 10, but the canvas water bag hung from a hook near his elbow, and he hadn't offered, and something in her refused to ask. She tried conversation. Once, twice, a third time. His answers came back in single syllables and short grunts, the conversational equivalent of a closed door. After the 4th attempt, she stopped trying and sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape change from scrubland to open range to something wilder and more remote than anything she had ever seen from a parlor window in New York. The sun crawled across the sky and sank behind the western hills like it was tired of watching. The ranch appeared in the purple dusk. 4 walls, a tin roof, a porch with 1 rocking chair, empty, which somehow felt like the saddest detail of the whole long day. Eli carried her trunk inside without a word. The door creaked on its hinges. Rose stepped through and stopped. A cast iron stove, a table made of rough-hewn planks, 2 chairs that didn't match, bare walls, bare windows, no curtains, no pictures, no flowers, no soft edges of any kind. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and something older underneath it, the particular smell of a house that had gone too long without laughter inside it. Rose unpacked slowly. Silk ribbons, a silver hand mirror, a leather-bound volume of poetry she had read so many times the spine had softened. She set the mirror on the windowsill, and it caught the last of the evening light and threw a bright square against the bare wall behind her. It looked ridiculous, all of it, like putting a chandelier in a cave. Eli appeared in the bedroom doorway. He pointed toward the narrow room off the main space. "Bedroom's there. I'll take the barn." He rubbed the back of his neck. The door closed behind him. Rose made dinner. Beans and biscuits. She burned both. The beans formed a black crust on the bottom of the pot. The biscuits came out heavy as river stones, dense enough to use for ballast. She set his plate in front of him and watched him eat every single bite without flinching, without commenting, without so much as a raised eyebrow. "Thank you," he said when the plate was clean. 2 words. Then the scrape of his chair legs on the floor, the soft clink of his plate in the wash basin, the sound of the front door opening and closing, and then silence. Rose sat alone at the table. The coal oil lamp hissed and threw shadows into every corner. She counted the knot holes in the wood of the table in front of her. 7. She counted them again. Outside, a faint yellow glow appeared in the barn window. He was still awake. 20 feet away, and she might as well have been on the moon. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and stared at that distant light until her hand went numb. What kind of man eats burned beans without a word but cannot look his own wife in the eye? If you've ever arrived somewhere new and felt completely invisible, completely unseen by the one person who was supposed to see you, stay with me. Because what comes next is the part nobody tells you about. The slow, quiet, extraordinary thing that happens when 2 people stop waiting for the other one to speak first. Days pass like that, one sliding into the next without ceremony. Rose woke each morning to coffee already made. The stove is already warm. The front door stands open to the cool dawn air. Eli was always gone before her feet touched the cold floor, already out in the fields, already at work, already doing the 10,000 things that a ranch demands of man before the sun has fully risen. She watched him through the window. He moved with the easy economy of someone who had been doing hard physical work alone for years. No wasted motion, no hesitation, mending the split-rail fence along the north pasture, hauling water from the creek in wooden buckets that left dark, wet trails in the dust, checking the hooves of the bay mare, one leg at a time, patient as stone. She noticed his hands, large, calloused. The knuckles were scarred and sun-darkened. They handled tools the way other men handled playing cards, certain and quick and completely at home. One morning a young colt, chestnut with wild eyes and ears pressed flat against its skull, was pacing the fence line of the corral when Rose stepped onto the porch. It kicked at the rails. She stopped. Eli came around the corner of the barn, and she stepped back without thinking, expecting him to get a rope, to raise his voice, to do what men usually do when an animal won't cooperate. He didn't do any of that. He opened the gate and walked in with empty hands. No rope, no whip, nothing. He stood in the middle of the corral with his palms open at his sides and just waited. The colt snorted and circled. Through its head, showed the whites of its eyes. Eli didn't move. The colt circled again, slower this time. Its ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again. Eli waited. Rose's fingers tightened on the porch rail. Her breath went shallow. Minutes passed. The colt stopped. It stood 10 feet away, sides heaving, nostrils wide. Then one step, then another. It stretched its neck toward him, muscles trembling under the dusty coat. Eli raised one hand, slow and careful, as though moving through deep water. His palm found the colt's neck. He stroked once, twice. The colt's whole body seemed to exhale, like it had been holding something in for a very long time and had only just decided it was safe to let it go. Rose's breath caught in her throat, so sharp it almost hurt. Those hands, the same hands that hadn't touched her once since she arrived. Rough as old tree bark against that trembling neck. Gentle as anything she had ever seen in her life. She stood there on the porch long after they had both gone back into the barn, her own hands wrapped around her cold coffee cup, thinking about things she didn't quite have words for yet. The next morning, she didn't wait at the window. She found a bucket by the henhouse door and picked it up. Eli looked at her. I looked at the bucket. His eyebrows rose 1/4 of an inch, the most expression she had seen from him in 2 weeks. He took the bucket from her hands, showed her how to hold it low against her hip so the chickens couldn't knock it over when they rushed for the feed. He didn't lecture. He didn't sigh. He just moved her hands into position and stepped back. She learned to check the feed trough for rust. She learned that the hand pump needed 3 hard pulls before the water ran clear. She learned to read the sky. Clouds stacking in the west meant rain. Clouds moving fast and flat meant wind and nothing else. Eli taught all of it without words. A nod when she got something right. A small shake of his head when she didn't. He never took a tool from her hands in frustration. Never rolled his eyes. Just waited while she figured it out and then moved to the next thing. Her palms blistered, then calloused. The blisters hurt. The calluses didn't. By the end of the 2nd week, her biscuits had stopped resembling river stones. Eli took seconds one evening. Didn't comment on it. Just took them. Are you still with me? Good. Because this is where something starts to shift. Something small. Something you could easily miss if you blinked. But the small things are always where the real story is hiding, aren't they? One evening, Rose came inside to start supper and stopped in the doorway. Wildflowers sat on the kitchen table. Purple sage and yellow columbine. The dirt still clung to the roots. The stems were wrapped in wet burlap and leaned against the side of the salt cellar. No note, no ribbon, just flowers plain and honest, like someone had pulled them from the earth 5 minutes ago and walked them straight here. The barn door was already closed. The lamp inside is already lit. Rose crossed to the table and touched one petal with her fingertip. Soft, still cool from the shade where it had grown. Something her mother used to say rose up from somewhere deep inside her chest, quiet and clear as a bell. Watch what a man does, child. Any fool can talk pretty. She found a tin cup in the cupboard, filled it with water from the pump, and arranged the flowers inside. The stems were too long for the cup, and the whole arrangement looked clumsy and slightly ridiculous. She sat on the windowsill where the morning light would reach it first. Then she sat down at the table with paper and a pen. She wrote a letter to her sister back in New York. For pages, she told her about the journey, the dust, the silence, the man who seemed to communicate entirely through coffee and wild flowers and small patient gestures. She folded it, slid it into an envelope, wrote the address in her careful hand. She didn't mail it. The letter sat on the shelf beside her book of poetry for a week. She picked it up sometimes, put it back down. If she mailed it, her sister would write back and ask questions Rose didn't know how to answer yet. She was learning a new language. The vocabulary was strange. Buckets and blisters and purple sage in a tin cup. But she was starting to recognize the grammar. And somewhere underneath all that quiet, something was beginning to feel for the very first time since she had stepped off that coach, like the start of something real. Rose Calloway crossed 2,000 miles for something she couldn't name and found a man who hadn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. But in part 2, she's going to discover something about Eli Trask that changes the way she sees everything. Something buried so deep it took 3 years of silence to grow over it. And the moment she finds out, she will never look at his quietness the same way again. Stay with me. The morning of the 3rd week, Rose woke before dawn. She dressed in the dark, moving quietly through the room she had slowly begun to recognize as hers, pulling on the work boots she had bought in town the previous week. Ugly things, brown leather, built for function and nothing else, the kind of boots her mother would have fainted at the sight of. She laced them up without lighting the lamp and walked out to the corral. Eli was already there, brushing down the bay mare in the pale pre-dawn dark. He looked up when he heard her boots on the packed earth, looked at the boots, then back at her face. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, but the shape of something just before a smile, the way a door looks when it's been left open, just a crack. He held out the brush. She took it. Their fingers touched for half a second. Rough against rough. Callous against callous. He stepped back and let her work. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, and the light hit the barn roof first, then the corral fence, then the mare's chestnut coat, and everything turned gold for a few minutes in a way that made Rose's chest ache without quite knowing why. She didn't hear him leave, but when she turned around, Eli was gone, and on the fence post nearest her, placed where she couldn't possibly miss it, sat a pair of worn leatherwork gloves. Too big for her hands by full size. She put them on anyway. The weeks found their rhythm. Rose learned to rise before full light. Learn the creak of the third floorboard, the one that groaned if your foot landed left of center. I learned to move quietly through the dark kitchen, finding the coffee pot and the tin cups and the box of matches by feel. Eli still rose earlier. But now when she came outside with her cup warming her palms, he nodded once, brief, and went back to whatever he had started. By the 6th week, she could read his silences the way she had once read sheet music. A short grunt meant good. A longer exhale through the nose meant not quite. A single small shake of his head meant stop before you hurt yourself. And the rare nod, the one that came with actual eye contact, meant something that lived in the same neighborhood as praise. She was thinking about all of this, about how much could pass between two people without a single word being spoken, when Martha and Ezra Holloway arrived in their wagon on a Tuesday afternoon. Martha Holloway was a round woman with gray hair and the kind of voice that could carry across 3 open fields without effort. She climbed down from the wagon before Ezra had fully stopped the horses and marched across the yard with her hand already extended. "Hello there. You must be the new Mrs. Trask." Rose's hand found the porch rail. She hadn't thought of herself that way yet. Not really. Martha took both of Rose's hands in hers and pumped them twice. Then she leaned in close and dropped her voice to a stage whisper that was somehow louder than her regular speaking voice. "Seems like you got the same problem around here as we do at home. Doesn't talk much, does he?" "Come inside," Rose said. "I'll make coffee." Martha Holloway talked enough for 6 people. She settled into one of the kitchen chairs like she had been sitting there for years, and her eyes moved around the room, taking in the wild flowers on the windowsill, the bare walls Rose hadn't quite figured out how to soften, the 2 mismatched chairs. "Lord have mercy," she said. "This place needs a woman's touch, something fierce. Good thing you showed up when you did." Ezra sat by the stove and said nothing. His eyes were kind. He nodded at Rose once, then seemed entirely content to let his wife carry the whole weight of the conversation. Martha did more than carry it. She delivered it gift wrap with a bow on top. The community gathered for church at the Fenton Place once a month. There were barn raisings whenever anyone needed one, which was always. Mrs. Patterson made the best apple pie in 3 counties and refused to share the recipe with a single living soul, not even on her deathbed, which Martha considered a genuine sin against humanity. Rose poured more coffee. "How long have you known Eli?" she asked. Martha's face changed. Something softened around the edges of it, something that looked like grief wearing the mask of fondness. "Since he was a boy running barefoot through these fields." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "His parents were good people, Henry and Ruth. Salt of the earth, both of them. Then the fever came through the valley 3 years back. Hit this ranch the hardest." Rose's hands went still. Ruth went first. Henry followed 4 days later. Martha shook her head slowly. "Couldn't live without her, I suppose. Some men are like that." Rose's throat tightened. He had never mentioned it. He wouldn't. Martha set down her cup. That man wouldn't complain if his boots were on fire. He buried them himself. Both of them. Didn't ask a soul for help. I didn't want it. Just dug the holes under that cottonwood tree out back and got on with the business of living." She paused. "If you can call it that." Ezra spoke for the first time. 2 words, quiet and deliberate as falling leaves. "Good man." Martha nodded. "Best kind. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up when you need him and never once asks for anything in return." Her sharp eyes settled on Rose's face. "I told Ezra when we heard he'd sent for a bride. I said, that girl has either got grit or she's got nothing at all." She smiled. "Looking at your hands right now, I'd say grit." Rose looked down at her hands. Martha was right. The calluses had thickened. The skin had darkened from sun and wind and work. These were not the hands of a woman who had danced at cotillion balls and worn silk gloves to afternoon tea. "Do you want my advice?" Martha leaned forward. "Don't try to fix him. Just stand next to him long enough. He'll fix himself." They left an hour later. Martha hugged Rose like they were old friends. Ezra shook her hand once, firm and brief, and said nothing more. Rose watched the wagon roll away down the track. The dust settled. The afternoon sun slanted low across the empty yard. She stood there for a long time, thinking about a young man digging 2 graves alone under a cottonwood tree, filling them alone, walking back to an empty house alone. 3 years of silence. 3 years of eating meals at a table built for 2 with only 1 chair filled. That evening, Rose made coffee, strong and black, the way he drank it. She carried the cup across the yard. The barn door stood open. Lantern light spilled warm across the packed dirt. She could hear inside the steady scrape of a brush against the mare's coat, the soft sound of the horse shifting her weight. Rose stepped through the doorway. Eli looked up. The brush stopped mid-stroke. His eyebrows lifted a fraction. She set the cup on a hay bale near his elbow, turned, started walking back toward the house. His voice stopped her at the door. Rose. Just her name. Nothing attached to it, but something in the way he said it. Not flat, not empty. Something underneath that she couldn't quite name, something that had been in there all along, waiting for the smallest opening. She turned her head, but didn't look back fully. Yes, a pause, long enough for the mare to snort and stamp 1 hoof. Coffee is good. Rose nodded once, walked out into the cooling dark, crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps. Her hands were shaking when she reached the kitchen. She pressed them flat against the edge of the stove and stood there staring at her own reflection in the dark window glass. She was smiling. She couldn't remember when she had started. 2 words. Coffee is good. That's it. And she's shaking in the kitchen. Have you ever had a moment like that? Where something so small, so ordinary, somehow cracked you wide open? That's exactly what's happening here. And it's only going to get deeper. Because in the next part, Rose is going to fall sick, and what Eli does in those 4 days is going to tell you everything you need to know about who this man really is. That night, lying awake on the corn husk mattress, Rose listened to the silence of the house. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something waiting to be filled. She pressed her hand against her chest and felt her heart beating hard beneath her palm. He had said her name, the first time since she had arrived. She lay there in the dark for a long time, thinking about calloused hands that could gentle a terrified colt, about wildflowers wrapped in wet burlap, about a man who had dug 2 graves alone and then came back inside and made coffee. What else was buried under all that quiet? She was still thinking about that when her eyes finally closed. She didn't know it yet, but in a few days' time, she would find out. Rose is just starting to understand what kind of man she married. She's just starting to feel the walls come down. And then she falls sick with a fever that won't break. And for 4 days and 4 nights, Eli Trask will do something that no one who knew him would have predicted. Something that will change everything between them. Don't go anywhere. Part 3 is where this story breaks your heart open and starts putting it back together. The fever came on a Thursday morning. Rose woke up with her head pounding like something was trying to get out of it, her skin hot to the touch, the kind of heat that doesn't feel like warmth. She tried to stand. The room tilted sideways. She grabbed the bedpost and held on until the walls decided to stop moving. Just a chill, she told herself. Just her body catching up with weeks of work it hadn't been built for. She was fine. She would be fine. She made it to the kitchen, started the coffee. Her hands shook so badly that the ground spilled across the stovetop like dark snow. Eli found her slumped sideways against the kitchen table an hour later. She heard his boots on the floorboards, felt his hand, rough and warm, pressing against her forehead. He made a sound low in his throat. Not a word. Something more animal and more urgent than any word. The sound of a person who has just understood something and doesn't like what they understand. Then his arms were under her, lifting. The ceiling beams passed overhead in slow procession. The bedroom doorway. The mattress rose up to meet her back. Stay, he said. 1 word, an order. She didn't have the strength to disagree. The next 4 days blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain. Rose drifted in and out of the world. Sometimes the room was bright with afternoon light coming sharp through the bare window. Sometimes it was deep night, the coal oil lamp burning low on the bedside table, throwing shapes against the walls that jumped and swayed with every gust of wind that found its way through the cracks. But always, every single time she opened her eyes, Eli was there. He sat in a ladder-back chair pulled close to the side of the bed. His hat was off. His hair, brown and longer than she had realized, fell across his forehead in unwashed tangles. He held a bowl in both hands. Steam rose from it in thin, white curls. "Broth," he said. "Drink." She drank. Salty and hot, and so deeply good it made her want to weep, the way something simple and nourishing can make you feel when you're sick enough to have forgotten what it feels like to be cared for. A cool cloth appeared on her forehead. She hadn't seen him dip it, hadn't seen him wring it out. But there it was, wet and cold against her burning skin, and the relief was so sudden and so complete that her eyes stung with something that wasn't the fever. When the cloth went warm, he replaced it, again and again and again. Sometime during the first night, Rose woke to the sound of his voice, low and rough and unpracticed, like a door hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. He was reading. She turned her head slowly toward the sound. He held a leather-bound book in his hands. The cover was worn soft at the corners and cracked along the spine. His mother's Bible. Rose recognized it from the shelf, where it had sat untouched since the day she arrived. "The Lord is my shepherd," he read, stumbling a little over the rhythm of it. "I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth." He paused. I tried again. "He restoreth my soul." His voice cracked on the last word. Just once. He cleared his throat and kept going. Page after page. Psalm after psalm. The words washed over Rose like river water over smooth stone, filling in the cracks, carrying away things that didn't need to stay anymore. She didn't know if he was reading for her or for himself. At that moment, it didn't matter at all. She closed her eyes and let herself drift towards something that felt, for the first time in weeks, like safety. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. Rose opened her eyes to gray dawn light and a head that was finally, blessedly clear. Her body ached like she had been rolled down a hillside, every muscle protesting, every joint stiff and complaining. But the burning was gone. The room held still when she turned her head. Eli was asleep in the chair. His chin rested on his chest. The Bible lay open in his lap with one hand still pressed flat against the thin pages, as if he had fallen asleep mid-verse. Dark circles shadowed the skin beneath his eyes. For days of stubble covered his jaw, maybe 5. He hadn't left. Not once. Not for chores. Not for proper sleep. Nothing. Rose watched him breathe. In and out. Slow and steady. His chest rising and falling beneath the faded cotton of his shirt. Her throat tightened so suddenly that she had to turn her face toward the wall and press her eyes shut hard until the stinging stopped. When she looked back, he was awake, watching her. "Better?" His voice was scraped raw from 4 nights of reading aloud. "Better." He nodded, stood slowly. His knees popped loud in the quiet room, the sound of joints that had been bent in one position for too long. He set the Bible on the bedside table, walked out without another word. Rose heard the front door open, heard his boots cross the porch, heard the barn door creak on its hinges. She lay still for a long time, her hand resting on the worn leather cover of his mother's Bible. The warmth from where his hand had rested was already gone, but she could still feel it somehow. The next morning she could stand without the room spinning. She dressed slowly, her legs feeling borrowed and unreliable, and pushed open the bedroom door. She stopped. Curtains hung at the windows. Rough cotton fabric, faded blue, like a work shirt washed 100 times until all the color had gone soft. The hems were uneven, clearly cut with shears made for leather, not fabric, stitched by hands that were far more familiar with mending harness than with sewing cloth. One panel hung a full inch lower than the other. Rose crossed the room and touched the fabric. It was soft from washing. Someone had washed it before hanging it up. Someone had taken the time to think about that. On the windowsill, a jar of wildflowers. Purple sage and yellow columbine, just like before, but fresh. The water is still clear. And against the wall beside the headboard, a small shelf had been nailed up. Raw wood, sanded smooth along the edges so it wouldn't catch or splinter. Just wide enough for a few books. Her volume of poetry was already there, spine facing out, placed with care. She turned toward the doorway. Eli stood in the kitchen, his hands hanging at his sides. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, at the dust motes floating in the morning light, at anything except her face. The tips of his ears had gone red. Doesn't fit right. His voice came out rough, almost offensive. The curtains. I could take them down. Redo them if you want. They're perfect. He cleared his throat, shifted his weight, rubbed the back of his neck with one calloused hand. The shelf, too. If it ain't level, I can. It's perfect. He nodded once. Sharp and quick. I turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him. His boots crossed the porch fast, almost running. Rose stood alone in the kitchen with both hands still pressed against the uneven curtain fabric. Her chest hurt, not from the fever, from something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with being sick and everything to do with being seen. Did you feel that? Crooked curtains. A shelf with sanded edges so it wouldn't catch her fingers. A man who sat in a hard wooden chair for 4 days straight rather than leave her side and then couldn't look her in the eye when she said thank you. If this story is touching something in you, please share it. Because there are people listening who need to hear this too. Now stay with me, because what happens next, the night they finally talk, is the moment this story becomes something you'll carry with you for a long time. That evening they sat at the table together. The coal oil lamp burned low between them. Rose's hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. Eli stared somewhere past her left shoulder, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming a slow, absent rhythm on the tabletop. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Not empty, full of things pressing to get out. Rose spoke first. Will you tell me about them? Your parents. The drumming stopped. A muscle jumped beneath the stubble on his jaw. For a long moment, she thought she had pushed too far, asked for too much, broken something fragile that had only just begun to form. Then the words came, slow and heavy, like stones dropping one at a time into still water. Pa taught me to work. The lamp flickered. A moth beat against the glass chimney. Ma taught me to pray. He stopped. His fingers lay flat on the table. The knuckles had gone white from pressing. They went quickly. Fever took them both inside a week. Some folks linger for months. They didn't. He swallowed. His throat moved. Buried them under the cottonwood. Out back. His voice dropped until Rose had to lean forward to hear. Ma liked that tree. Used to sit under it evenings when the work was done. She said the leaves sounded like water running over rocks. He stopped talking. Rose reached across the table and laid her hand over his. She felt the calluses, the old scars, the tension running through him like wire pulled too tight. He didn't pull away. He didn't squeeze back. He just stayed, let her hand rest on top of his. Let the warmth pass between them in the silence. The lamp burned lower. The shadows grew. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark hills, and another answered from far away. Rose's thumb found the thickest callus on his palm. She traced it slowly, felt the ridge of skin built up from years of gripping tools and reins and fence posts. Years of work stored there like rings in the heartwood of an old tree. Eli's breath caught, just once, barely audible. He turned his hand over slowly, carefully, and his palm faced up, and her fingers rested in the hollow of his hand. They sat like that until the lamp guttered and died, until the room went full dark, until Rose couldn't see his face anymore, only felt the rough warmth of his skin against hers. When she finally stood to go to bed, he spoke. Rose. She stopped at the bedroom door. I ain't. He paused. Started again. Words don't come easy for me. Never have. I know. But Another pause. Longer. The darkness hid his face, but not the weight of what he was carrying. I'm glad you're better. Rose couldn't see him, but she could hear everything underneath those simple words. Everything he couldn't say. Everything he might never find the language for. I'm glad too, she whispered. She stepped into the bedroom, closed the door, pressed her back against the rough wood, and stood there in the dark, her hands still warm from where his fingers had held hers. Outside, the wind picked up. The new curtains stirred against the window frame, brushing the glass with a sound like a quiet breath. Something real has begun between them. Something built not from grand speeches or perfect moments, but from 4 days in a hard wooden chair and a pair of crooked curtains and a hand turned palm up in the dark. But part 4 is going to test everything they have built. A storm is coming. 300 head of wild cattle. And Eli Trask is going to ride out alone into the worst night of the year. And Rose is going to have to reckon with something she didn't know she felt until the moment she might lose it. Don't you dare leave now. The heat came down like a hammer. Rose woke each morning to air so thick and hot it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The creek behind the barn had shrunk to a muddy trickle. The cattle clustered under the few cottonwood trees, sides heaving, too exhausted to graze. Eli rode out before dawn every day that week, saddling the bay mare in the dark and heading north toward the ridgeline. Rose watched him go from the porch with her coffee cooling in her hands. He came back hours later with dust settled into every crease of his face and something hard and watchful in his eyes. "What are you looking for?" she asked one evening. He stood at the water pump, splashing his face and neck. Water darkened his collar and ran down his shirt. He straightened and wiped his eyes. Wild herd. Cattle gone feral up in the high country. He pointed north toward the mountains, sitting blue and distant against the sky. Abandoned spreads up there from the bad years. People left. The cattle stayed. Bred wild. He shook his head. Drought pushes them down. They come looking for water and grass. Rose waited. If they come through the valley when a storm hits. He stopped. What happens? They stampede. 300 heads, maybe more. They'll flatten everything in their path. Fences, crops, livestock. He looked at her. Houses. Can no one stop them? Not stop. Turn. He picked up the towel hanging by the pump and dried his face. Somebody would have to ride into the middle of them. Turn the lead cattle toward the eastern basin before they hit the valley floor. Somebody. He walked past her into the house without answering. The signs multiplied over the following days. Dust clouds on the northern horizon, moving with purpose. Their own cattle pacing the fence line instead of grazing. The milk cow kicked over her pail. The chickens refused to settle until full dark. Something in the air had changed, pressed down and charged, like the sky was holding its breath. Eli came back one afternoon with his jaw set tight. He unsaddled the mare without speaking, brushed her down without speaking, walked to the porch where Rose stood waiting, and stopped at the bottom step. "How many?" Rose asked. 300. Maybe more. How close? 2 days. Maybe 3. He looked north. The storm's coming too. I can smell it. What do we do? Meeting tomorrow. Calloway Place. He climbed the steps and stopped beside her. His hand lifted, almost touched her arm, then dropped back. "Make extra biscuits," he said quietly. "We'll bring them." The Calloway barn was full. Rose counted 15 people. Ranchers and farmers from spreads scattered across the valley, all of them wearing the same tight expression, the particular look of people who are frightened but have too much pride to say so directly. They stood between the hay bales and low clusters that went quiet when Eli walked in. Martha Calloway pressed a cup of water into Rose's hands. "You'd think the end of the world was coming," she said under her breath. The talk went around the barn. 300 heads coming down through Miller's Canyon. Straight shot to the valley floor. A storm on top of that. An older man with a gray beard and hands like knotted rope shook his head. "We ain't got the hands to turn a herd that size." A younger voice from across the barn. "What about the eastern basin? How are you going to push 300 stampeding cattle anywhere by yourself?" The voices rose and overlapped. Arguments and fear all tangled up together. Rose watched Eli. He stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, face unreadable. Ezra Calloway raised one hand. The barn went quiet. "I have seen men try to turn a stampede," he said. His voice was perfectly flat and perfectly calm. "Seen the buried too." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Eli uncrossed his arms and stepped forward into the lantern light. Rose saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, something older and harder than fear. The face of a man who has already made up his mind and is only now letting the rest of the world catch up. "Maybe I'll do it." The words landed in the silence like stones thrown into still water. "By yourself, Silas. That's a death sentence. I know the canyons. I know how they run. If I can get ahead of them before they hit the valley floor." "You'll get yourself killed." Eli shrugged. "Might." Ezra stepped close, and put one weathered hand on Eli's arm. "Son, you ride into that hurt alone, you might not ride out. Aim not to, but if somebody doesn't, there'll be nothing left standing come morning." Martha's voice cut across the barn like a cleaver. "Lord, that man has got more stubborn in one little finger than most people carry in their whole body." A few people laughed. Short, nervous sounds. The tension cracked, but didn't break. Rose found Eli outside when the meeting broke up. He was already checking the mare's cinched strap, running his hands along the leather with the focused attention of a man who is already somewhere else in his mind. She grabbed his arm. He stopped and turned. "You cannot go alone." Her voice came out harder than she meant it to. "There has to be another way." He looked at her. The moonlight caught his eyes and held them. For just a moment, something in his face opened up. She saw what lived under the calm. The doubt. The terrible weight of what he had volunteered to carry. Somebody has to. Then let it be somebody else. There isn't anybody else. He pulled his arm free, gently but completely. "This is what I do, Rose. Look after the people here. Keep them safe." He paused. "The only difference now is I've got something to come back to." He mounted the mare. I gathered the reins. Looked down at her from the saddle. "A storm hits tomorrow night. Maybe the night after. I'll be back before dawn. That's a promise." He rode off into the dark. Rose stood in the yard and watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Martha appeared beside her and pressed something into her hand. A handkerchief. Rose hadn't realized she was crying. "Come inside, child. Nothing to do now but wait and pray." Rose looked north. The stars were already disappearing behind clouds she couldn't see yet. The air had changed, heavier, charged, the particular pressure of something enormous gathering itself to fall. Somewhere beyond those invisible clouds, 300 head of wild cattle were moving toward the valley. And somewhere between here and there, the man she had married was riding alone into the dark. The storm hit at dusk. Rose stood at the window and watched the sky turn green, then the deep purple-black of a bruise. Lightning tore the horizon open in jagged white lines. Thunder followed, not the distant polite rumble of an ordinary storm, but full-body crashes that shook dust from the rafters and rattled the glass in its frame. Then the rain. Not gradual. A wall of water that slammed against the house like something that had been saving itself up for a very long time. The windows shuddered. The crooked curtains, his curtains, swayed in the draft that crept through every crack. Eli had left an hour ago. She had watched him saddle the mare in the strange green pre-storm light. I had watched him check the cinch strap 2 times, 3 times. I watched him swing up into the saddle and turn north without looking back. She had wanted to run after him, had wanted to grab the reins and beg him with everything she had not to go. She had stood on the porch and not moved. Now she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared into chaos. Rain streamed down in sheets, so heavy she couldn't see the barn, couldn't see the corral, couldn't see anything at all except water and darkness and the occasional burst of white light that burned shapes into her eyes for seconds after it faded. The clock on the mantel ticked. Rose moved to the table, sat down, wrapped both hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold hours ago. She thought about New York, the brownstone on Lexington Avenue, her bedroom with the rose-patterned wallpaper and the lace curtains her mother had ordered from France. The suitors who came calling on Sunday afternoons in their press suits with their practiced smiles and their rehearsed compliments. None of those men would ride into a storm for strangers. Not one of them. The clock ticked. 9, 10, 11. Rose tried to pray. The words came out broken. Pieces of hymns half remembered from childhood Sundays. "The Lord is my shepherd." Thunder drowned the rest. She started again. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow." Lightning so close the whole room turned white, and she couldn't finish the line because she couldn't remember what came next. Midnight. She stood, paced to the window and back. To the window again. Her boots tracked mud she hadn't noticed bringing inside. She picked up the coffee cup, set it down, picked it up again. Count the knot holes in the table. 7. The same 7 that had kept her company on the first night she sat alone in this kitchen wondering what she had done with her life. She counted them again. She was still counting when her stomach heaved, and she made it to the door and off the porch before her knees buckled, and everything came up at once. coffee and fear and everything she had been holding inside since he rode away. She retched until there was nothing left, and then her body kept trying anyway, heaving air, her whole torso shaking with the effort. The rain soaked through her dress in seconds. Her hair plastered against her face and neck. Water ran into her eyes and her mouth, and she couldn't tell anymore whether she was crying or if the storm was just taking her apart. Her foot slipped on the wet boards. She went down hard, knees first, then hands, then the rest of her sliding off the porch into the mud below. The mud was cold, black. It swallowed her hands to the wrists and soaked through her skirt and pressed against her skin with an intimacy that felt obscene. She tried to push herself up. Her arm shook and gave out. Her cheek hit the mud. She lay there. The rain hammered her back. She lay there in the mud behind a ranch house in the middle of empty country, covered in filth, unable to stand, unable to stop the shaking, thinking about hooves and darkness and a man she had only just begun to understand. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Long enough for the cold to settle into her bones like it meant to winter there. Long enough for the shaking to stop because her body had simply run out of anything left to shake with. She crawled back to the porch on her hands and knees, through the mud that seemed to resist her, up the steps, through the door she had left open behind her. She collapsed on the kitchen floor. Didn't change. Didn't wash. Just lay there with the mud drying on her face and in her hair, staring at the ceiling while the storm raged on, while the clock ticked, while the dark hours ground past one by one. 4 in the morning, then 5. Gray light crept through the windows. Rose pushed herself up. I walked to the porch, wrapped the quilt from the rocking chair around her mud-caked shoulders without caring what she was ruining. The air smelled of wet sage and turned to earth. The storm had blown itself out somewhere in the early hours, leaving behind puddles and silence and the strange sweetness that follows a night of violence. She stared at the northern horizon. Gray sky, gray land, nothing moving. Minutes passed. The light grew. Then movement, a shape in the mist. Slow, too slow. Horse and rider. Rose was off the porch before she knew her legs had decided to move. Her bare feet, she had lost her boots somewhere in the night, slapped through puddles and mud, and she didn't feel any of it. The shape grew clearer through the pale morning mist. The bay mare, lathered and stumbling. And on her back, Eli, slumped forward over the horse's neck, his hands tangled in the mane, not holding the reins, just clinging. Rose grabbed the bridle. The mare stopped, sides heaving, eyes rolling. Eli. He lifted his head. His face was the color of ash beneath the grime. His eyes found her slowly, barely focusing. His shirt was torn open at the shoulder, and beneath the torn fabric the skin was raw and glistening. He tried to dismount, swung one leg over, slid down the mare's side, and his knees buckled the moment his boots touched the ground. Rose caught him. His full weight slammed into her and nearly took them both down into the mud. She locked her knees, planted her feet, held on with everything she had. He smelled like rain and sweat and horse and blood. "You're alive," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "You're alive." His forehead dropped against her shoulder. And for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach into the dust of Redstone Creek, Eli Trask let himself be held. He made it back. He promised he would, and he did. But the cost of it, what she sees when she gets him inside, what he tells her when he finally has enough strength to speak, that is a conversation that is going to crack something open between them that can never be closed again. Stay right where you are. He's alive. He made it back. But the wounds on his hands and chest tell a story that words couldn't. And when Eli finally speaks, everything he says and everything he cannot say is going to bring these two people to the truest moment of this entire story. Part 5 is the ending. And it is the kind of ending that reminds you what love actually looks like when it stops pretending to be something else. Do not go anywhere. Rose half carried him across the yard. His arm hung heavy over her shoulders. His boots dragged twin furrows through the mud behind them. She couldn't feel her own legs anymore, just the weight of him pressing down, the strain across her lower back, the single driving need to keep moving forward. The porch steps were the hardest part. She took them one at a time. Eli lifted his foot, set it down, lifted again. His hand gripped her shoulder hard enough to leave bruises she would find days later and press her fingers against deliberately, just to feel them there. They made it inside. She lowered him into the chair by the stove. His head fell back. His eyes closed. His chest heaved. Rose didn't stop to think. She pulled off his wet coat, fighting with sleeves that had plastered themselves to his arms. His shirt underneath was torn at the shoulder, soaked through and dark with more than rain. She unbuttoned it with shaking fingers and peeled it away from his body. The rope burn was worse than she had thought. A stripe of raw red and purple ran from his shoulder across his chest. The mark of a lariat pulled too hard against desperate weight, against 300 animals moving at full run. Blisters had formed along the edges and burst. Some of the skin had torn away entirely, leaving raw patches that wept. His hands were worse. She turned them over in her own hands and felt her stomach drop. The palms had been stripped in patches, the skin gone, the flesh beneath already swollen and weeping. She built the fire up until the cast iron stove glowed red. Heated water in the basin. Found the cleanest cloth she owned, which wasn't very clean at all by now, and started with his hands. He didn't make a sound. His jaw clenched when the warm water hit the raw flesh. She could see the muscles working beneath the stubble. But he didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just let her work. She cleaned the dirt and dried blood with the care of someone who understood, now, what these hands had done. Then she tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped them around his palms, tight enough to hold, loose enough to let the wounds breathe. The chest wound next. The same way, slow and thorough. When she finished, she made coffee, strong and black. She pressed the cup into his bandaged hands and watched him take the first sip. Color started coming back to his face. The gray faded. His breathing slowed. Rose pulled the other chair close and sat across from him. Her dress was still stiff with dried mud. Her hair hung in matted clumps. She hadn't washed, hadn't changed, hadn't done anything except focus on keeping him in the world. Biscuits, she said. I should make you something to eat. Stay. One word, but the way he said it. She sat back down. Eli looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. His eyes were clearer now, focused. He took another sip and set the cup on his knee, cradling it in his bandaged palms. You look like you wrestled a pig, he said. Rose let out a sound that was half laugh and half something much messier than that. I fell off the porch into the mud. Why? She stopped. Her throat went tight. Started again. I was scared. I thought you weren't coming back. I thought. She couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come out in any shape that made sense. Eli nodded, like that was more than enough. Like he understood everything she couldn't say and had filed it somewhere important. He drank more coffee. Found them in the canyon, he said finally. His voice was rough, scrape hollow. I was already running when I got there. Lightning had them spooked badly. 300 heads moving like one creature. All of them blind with fear and momentum. Rose didn't speak. She was holding very still in the way you do when you don't want to interrupt something that needs to come out on its own terms. Rode into the middle of them. He shook his head slowly. Coat off, waving it, yelling, trying to turn the lead animals before they hit the valley floor. He paused. They didn't want to turn. Keep pushing south, toward the ranches, toward the farms. He stopped, swallowed. Toward here. Rose's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. Got ahead of them finally. The mare knows that country. Her mother ran those trails before her. She found a side canyon I would have missed in the dark. Got us in front of the herd. Pushed the leaders east. The rest followed. He looked up at her. Herd animals do that. Follow the ones ahead of them. Even into nowhere. Even in an empty land where there's nothing left to destroy. How long? Hours. Lost count after the first few. He looked down at his bandaged hands. The horse stumbled once. Went down hard on her front knees. I rolled clear. He held up two bandaged fingers held close together. Hooves missed my head by about that much. The whole room seemed to contract. Rose's breath left her body and stayed gone for a long moment. Got back on, he said. Keep going. A storm broke around dawn. Herds settled in the basin. Tired and scared, but settled. Row back. And that's all. That's all. Like it was nothing. Like he hadn't ridden alone into a stampede in the middle of a storm. like he hadn't nearly died under the hooves of 300 wild cattle in the black mud. "You could have died," Rose said. He nodded. "Why?" "Somebody had to. That is not an answer. It's the only one I've got." "No." Rose's voice came out harder than she intended, sharper, but she held it. "You rode into a stampede alone in a storm for people who barely know your name. Why? What is it really?" Eli set down his cup. His bandaged hands rested on his knees. He looked at her, really looked, and Rose saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pride. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those. Something that had been living in him for a very long time. Pa used to say, he started, stopped, started again. You protect what's yours, even if it costs you. He paused, especially if it costs you. But those people aren't yours. The Calloways and the Fentons. They're just neighbors. Neighbors is what I've got. He looked down at his hands. I had them for 3 years. Neighbors, and nothing else worth counting. The word nothing landed in the space between them. Rose stood up. Her body ached in ways she hadn't fully felt until this moment. The dried mud on her dress cracked with every movement. She crossed the space between them and knelt on the floor beside his chair. The floor was hard against her knees. She didn't care. Eli. He looked down at her. Waiting. I came here looking for something different. Something that wasn't New York. Wasn't my mother's plans. Wasn't a man with pretty speeches and borrowed charm. She took a breath and let it out slowly. I thought I wanted a storybook romance. Someone who would sweep me off my feet with grand gestures and the right words at the right moment. He listened. That isn't what I found. Her voice shook. She let shake. I found a man who makes coffee before I wake up. Who hangs curtains crooked because he never learned to sew, but he tried anyway because he thought it might matter to me. Who sits in a hard wooden chair for 4 nights straight and reads psalms out loud to a sick woman because he doesn't know what else to do and he cannot stand to do nothing. Eli's breath caught. I found a man who rides into a stampede in a storm for neighbors he says are all he's got. A man who nearly loses his life for people he will never ask anything in return from. She laid her hand against his bandaged palm, felt the thick wrapping of torn petticoat under her fingers, felt his pulse beating steady underneath it. I'm not going back to New York. Her voice was clear and certain and completely without doubt. I'm not leaving. I'm staying here. Not as some arrangement. Not as a name on a piece of paper. As your wife. For real. If you'll still have me. His answer didn't come in words. His hand moved slowly, uncertain, trembling slightly against her hair, light as something that was afraid of its own weight. His fingers came to rest against her scalp. She leaned into the touch and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, his face was wet. She had never seen him cry, hadn't been sure he could. The sight of it, this man who had buried his parents alone and ridden into a stampede and sat in a hard wooden chair for 4 days straight. This man with tears on his weathered face undid something deep in her chest that had been clenched tight for a very long time. You scare me half to death, she whispered. His mouth moved. Something almost became a smile. Only half. The other half was too angry to be scared. And then he smiled. Small and fragile and new. Like something that hadn't been used in so long it had nearly forgotten how. Rose rose from her knees and sat on the arm of his chair. His arm went around her waist, careful of his wounds, careful of her weight. She leaned against his shoulder, and they stayed like that while the fire burned low and the morning light strengthened through the crooked curtains, and the world outside slowly dried and warmed and came back to itself. Clara, Rose, I ain't good with words. Never have been. Probably never will be. I know, but He swallowed hard. I'm glad you stayed. She turned her head and pressed her lips against his temple. Salt and dirt and something underneath that was just him, familiar now after all these weeks, familiar and necessary and right. So am I. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because the world needs more of them, and so do you. Outside, the sound of wagon wheels on the muddy track. Voices calling. Horses snorting. The neighbors were coming. 2 weeks later, the wagons arrived at dawn. Rose counted them from the porch. 1, 2, 5, 8. rolling up the track in a slow procession, wheels cutting fresh ruts in the soft earth. Men on the benches with tools across their laps. Women beside them with baskets covered in checkered cloth. Martha Holloway's wagon came first, and she was already climbing down before Ezra had stopped the horses. "Well," she said, looking at the small ranch house and the weathered barn and everything that needed doing. "We got work to do." The men unloaded fresh-cut lumber, pine boards still smelling of sap and sawdust. They carried them to a level patch of ground 50 yards from the old house, a spot with good drainage and full morning sun and room to grow. Eli emerged from the barn. His hands were still wrapped but healing. He stopped at the edge of the yard and stared at the lumber, at the men setting up sawhorses, at the women spreading blankets in the shade of the cottonwood tree beneath which his parents lay. Ezra walked over and put one weathered hand on Eli's shoulder, saying something Rose couldn't hear from the porch. Eli shook his head. Ezra said something else. Eli shook his head again. Then Ezra pressed a hammer into his bandaged hands, pointed at the lumber pile, and walked away without waiting for an answer. Eli stood for a long moment. The hammer hung at his side. His shoulders were tight. His jaw worked. Then he walked to the lumber pile and started sorting boards. By noon, the skeleton of a new house stood against the blue sky. For walls, no roof yet, just the bones of something that would become real. The fresh pine glowed pale gold in the sunlight. Martha appeared at Rose's elbow. "Told you," she said. "Stand next to him long enough. He'll fix himself." Rose took the cup of water Martha offered and drank. "I think maybe we fixed each other." Martha smiled. The lines around her eyes deepened into something warm and knowing. "Well," she said, "that's how it's supposed to work, ain't it?" The neighbors left at dusk, wagons creaking down the track, voices calling good night across the yard, lanterns bobbing in the gathering dark like fireflies drifting toward home. Rose walked through the skeleton of the new house alone, her boots quiet on the packed dirt floor. This would be the kitchen. This is the main room. This is the bedroom, larger than the old one, room for a proper bed, room for a life. She stopped in a smaller space off the main room, for walls roughed in. One window opening facing east where the morning light would arrive first. Just big enough for a cradle. Just big enough for what might come next. Footsteps behind her. She knew the sound of his boots by now, and could have picked them out from 100 other sounds without thinking. Eli stopped in the doorway and looked at her standing in the middle of the small room with her hand resting on the rough-cut frame. "Thinking?" he asked. "Imagining." He nodded. I looked around at the bare bones of the room. The sky showed through where the roof would go. "I need work." "Everything does," she said. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but closer than almost anything she had seen from him before, and closer than she had ever dared to hope for in those first cold, silent days. He crossed the space between them. His hand found hers. Their fingers laced together. He is rough and bandaged. Hers calloused now in ways that would have made the woman she used to be completely unrecognizable. They stood in the skeleton of their future and didn't say anything at all. The words weren't necessary anymore. Later, on the porch of the old house, they sat with their backs against the weathered boards and their faces turned toward the new frame standing pale in the moonlight. The night was cool. Stars scattered across the black sky, thick as salt spilled on a dark cloth. Rose reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. Soft and worn from handling. Eli looked at it. "Money from New York," she said. "I brought it when I came. Emergency fund. In case things didn't work out. In case I needed to run." He waited. "I want to use it for the roof. The windows. Whatever else we need." She held it out. He looked at the envelope, then at her face. The moonlight sat in his eyes. "That's yours," he said. "It was." She pressed it into his bandaged hands. "Now it's ours." He held it for a long moment without opening it, without counting the bills inside. Just held it like it weighed more than paper and ink and everything that paper and ink stood for. Then he sat on the porch rail and put his arm around her shoulders. Rose leaned into him, felt the solid warmth of his body against hers, smelled wood smoke and work and something underneath that was just Eli, familiar now after all these weeks, familiar and steady in hers. A coyote called somewhere in the dark hills. High and lonesome. Another answered from far away. "Rose." She looked up at him. I'm glad you stayed. She tilted her head against his shoulder. I'm glad you gave me something to stay for. Silence. The good kind. The full kind. The kind that holds things instead of hiding them. I'm still not much for talking, he said after a while. I know. Probably won't ever change. I know that too. Are you all right with that? Rose looked up at his face. The strong jaw. The weathered skin. The eyes that had learned to say everything his mouth couldn't manage. The lines that told the story of a man who had worked hard and grieved hard and loved quietly and kept going anyway. Turns out I'm learning a new language, she said. His arm tightened around her shoulders. I'm still a terrible cook. Biscuits are getting better. That is not saying much. A pause. Long enough for another coyote to call in the distance. No, he said. It ain't. She laughed. The sound surprised her. How easy it came, how natural it felt after so many weeks of silence. He made a sound that might have been a laugh too, rusty and unpracticed and completely unguarded, the sound of a man who is only just remembering that his face is allowed to do that. They sat on the porch of the old house and watched the moonlight fall on the bones of the new one. Tomorrow there will be more work. More neighbors arrived with lumber and nails. More walls going up. More rooms taking shape. The roof would come, and the windows, and then everything else, a home built board by board and day by hands that had finally learned to work together. But tonight, there was only this. Two people who had found each other in the silence between words, who had built something neither of them had been looking for when they started, who had learned, slowly and imperfectly and without any kind of manual, to speak the language the other one needed. Rose's head came to rest on his shoulder. His chin settled on her hair. The frame of the new house stood pale and open against the dark sky, full of possibility, full of rooms that didn't exist yet, full of everything that was still to come. Sometimes a story settles somewhere between the chest and the throat and stays there. This might be one of those. The image of two people on a porch in the moonlight watching the bones of a house they will build together. The weight of everything that was never said out loud and somehow said everything that mattered. Many of us have known a love like that. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in coffee left warming on the stove and curtains hung crooked but hung with care and a hand turned palm up in the dark. The kind that asks nothing and gives everything. The kind that waits. If you have known it, or if you are still looking for it, or if you're sitting right now next to someone who loves you in a language you're only just beginning to learn, then you know what this story is really about. And you know why it needed to be told. Thank you for staying until the very end.